Hi, everyone. Welcome to Dismantling Injustice, the podcast of Brooklyn Community Bail Fund. At BCBF, we work with allies to free people from incarceration, whether it's prison, jail, immigrant detention, or surveillance. And on this podcast, we offer analysis on issues affecting folks who encounter the criminal, legal, and immigration systems. I'm Carl Hammond Lipscomb, BCBF's Director of Advocacy and Policy, and I am here with Saleh Israel, our Director of Special Initiatives. Today we're going to talk about immigration, and we've talked a lot about immigration a lot over the last few weeks, and that's just because there's so much going on. As our audience probably knows, the criminalization, surveillance, separation, and of course the mass detention and deportation of immigrants began long before Biden, long before Trump, and it's well ingrained in U.S. immigration policy. As we discussed on previous shows, one of the first things that Biden did when he took office was sign a number of executive orders. Those are directives to federal agencies under his authority related to immigration. Right out the gate, these orders got a lot of attention and praise because they appeared to undo a lot of the harmful racist changes to immigration policy that took place under Trump. Since then, the Democrats have also introduced a pretty broad immigration bill a few weeks ago that also got a lot of positive attention from some corners. But again, as we always say on this show, the devil is in the details. As with most proposed changes to immigration policy over the last 25 years, there's some who will benefit, but millions more who will continue to be excluded and criminalized. As part of our ongoing commitment to holding the powers that be accountable, today we're going to look more closely at immigration policy thus far under President Biden. And to do that, we have a special guest with us. Our guest today is Benita Jain. She's a supervising attorney at Immigrant Defense Project, one of BCBF's closest partners, and she spent many years fighting the criminalization of our immigrant community members. She's trained hundreds, maybe thousands of attorneys on representing immigrants who've had contact with the criminal legal system. She's led policy campaigns and coalitions on every level of government, federal, state, and local. And she's published numerous resources for immigrant advocates, including myself. I know that throughout my career, I've turned to IDP as a resource and ally when I was a public defender and as an advocate for Black immigrants, continuing on to today. So welcome, Benita.
Thanks for having me on this, Carl, and for the kind words. It's how fun to be on BCBF, one of BCBF's first podcasts.
Of course. Thanks so much, for joining us. And so we're going to jump right in. So Biden's immigration proposals have been introduced in the House and Senate. And a lot of people have been excited because it'll benefit certain corners of the immigrant community. But my understanding is that a significant number of migrants will be excluded. Can you talk to us about the folks who will be excluded? Who are they? And what are the other implications of Biden's plan?
Yes. So you're right. Several bills have been introduced in the House and the Senate or are about to be introduced that create a path to citizenship for various groups of people. We know that people need relief. People have been just going through a lot, risking detention and deportation to stay in the U.S. with their families. So, you specifically mentioned Biden's bill, that's the U.S. Citizenship Act. It's the broadest of the bills that have been introduced so far. There's also the Dream and Promise Act, which create a path to citizenship for dreamers, which, I think we all know in this country by now are young people who came to the U.S. as kids, many of whom have DACA, but this expands beyond that, and for people with TPS, temporary protected status, or DED. TPS is a form of protection that avoids returning people to countries with unsafe conditions, for example, because of natural disasters or wars. There's a bill for farm workers, one for essential workers that has not yet been introduced, but is expected to drop sooner or later. And some of these smaller bills, Dream, Promise, farm workers, are expected to get a floor vote in the House soon and be taken up by the Senate. The U.S. Citizenship Act, that's Biden's bill, may also advance sometime after that. Before we talk about the exclusions in these bills, I wanted to touch on a broader area in the U.S. Citizenship Act, what people are referring to as the Biden bill. And that is the border and surveillance provisions in the bill. So, as you know, during the Trump administration, we heard a resounding cry for no bans, no walls, sanctuary for all. And the no wall part is the one that was easiest to comprehend, right? Because it was a physical wall. Now, what this bill does is it adds to the government's arsenal for increased surveillance at the southern border, the so-called smart wall that impacts safety and privacy in border communities. And, Carl, we have so much technology, so much of this technology already that includes things like autonomous towers, facial recognition, drones, and there's a history of privacy violations. Research also shows that this kind of technology results in more deaths by pushing people toward more dangerous crossings. Also, biometric data collection, which has increased in the last couple of years. So expanding this kind of technology is dangerous, and it not only affects border communities, but we know that once the government has the hard equipment, the software, the technology, it is often moved into the rest of the country. And just one example of this is the surveillance and enforcement by CBP agents during Black Lives Matter protests last year. And on the positive side, the U.S. Citizenship Act does include some fixes to current criminalization laws that we've been fighting for years, like changing the definition of convictions, so dispositions that states don't intend to be convictions will generally not be deportation triggers, adding an exemption and waiver for certain criminal system contacts. So there has been some recognition that we need to dismantle elements of the criminalization system, but there's so much more to disentangle and dismantle. So let's move ahead to your question about who's excluded from these bills. And I was thinking that, instead of parsing out or just parsing out the details of each of these bills, it may be useful to talk about a theme that's emerged in all of these bills. And, the theme, at least the one that has really, has really stood out for us, is that in each one of these bills, there are broad exclusions, like you mentioned, and specifically exclusions for people with criminal system contacts. Already, we know that current law excludes from most status people that have or admit to a variety of criminal system contacts, like drug offenses, a vague category called crimes involving moral turpitude, prostitution. There's more. There's a whole host of things. And these bills that I just mentioned chose to incorporate all of those exclusions, which will already cut off a ton of people, and then chose to add even more exclusions on top of them. So the U.S. Citizenship Act, for example, adds a bar for people with 3 misdemeanors or a felony. Certain things are exempt, like minor traffic offenses or immigration status-related ones, but by and large, it really expands the universe of people who will be barred from getting status. There's some exemptions and waivers available for some people based on recency of conviction or whether ICE, in its discretion, believes that the person should have a waiver. But, we know, and I'm sure you know from all the work that you've done at BCBF and before that, that, we can't count on DHS to broadly exercise discretion in favor of immigrants, and certainly not broadly in favor of immigrants that have already been targeted through the criminal system, because that becomes it's like this mark that you can't get over. So while we may push for prosecutorial discretion and waivers as harm reduction, they will not solve the problem. We can also, talk about the Dream and Promise Act. This is something that might be getting a floor vote soon. What the Dream and Promise Act do is they add all the bars that I just talked about that the U.S. Citizenship Act adds and goes even further. So as written today, even if a person has made it through all the hoops of exclusion that I just talked about, it allows DHS to use this very vague and discretionary secondary review process to bar young people from Dream Act relief. And this process threatens to sweep in young people caught up in racist policing in their neighborhoods. And you know this, I'm sure, from your work as a public defender, from your work with Baji. You know, kids of color, I mean, people of color generally, but kids of color, Latinx, Black, and Southeast Asian youth are much more likely to be committed or incarcerated than their white peers, 5 times as much for young Black kids. Soccer jerseys from El Salvador are looked upon by immigration judges or DHS as indicative of gang membership. Schools and local police designate through databases and other mechanisms youth as gang members. And, it's pretty disheartening that the DREAM Act, as it's currently written today, threatens to bring all of these experiences in as reasons for discretionary denial. So there's more, but unfortunately, I think these are some of the key exclusions that we are seeing in the citizenship bills that are moving through Congress right now. Having said that, our communities badly need a path to citizenship. We all know that. And we recognize that these bills, if passed, will provide urgently needed stability for millions of people. That's critical. That is absolutely meaningful. But we also recognize that doubling down on categories from the criminal system about who's deserving of rights and relief and who's not deserving comes at a cost. And we need to find a way forward that disentangles rather than further entrenches these hierarchies into our immigration system. And so I think our challenge now is how do we continue to build from here toward a fair and just immigration system for all, including one that doesn't legitimate systems of policing and incarceration.
Well, yes, I mean, what you're describing really is more of the same. I'll never forget when I was at Baji, we worked on this report on Black immigrants, and we looked at the DACA numbers, and only 3% of DACA recipients were Black. And it was largely because a lot of Black immigrants, a lot of Southeast Asian immigrants were excluded because they've had some sort of criminal contact. And so it sounds like this bill, is in that vein, except it'll actually be ingrained in law.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, we talked about Black youth and Latinx youth, but overall, and I know that this is a statistic that you've probably, seen used, researched over and over, but someone who's Black is almost 10 times as likely as someone who's white to be arrested for loitering, disorderly conduct, trespass, marijuana possession. The list goes on and on. And then so by continuing to ingrain these exclusions, by and large, what we're seeing is the old system of parsing out immigrants into who's considered good, who's considered bad, who's deserving of protection, who should be caged and kicked out. And that system is alive and well. And it's doing it using a criminal system that at its very core is built around racist policing, right? It's built around arresting, caging, removing people of color from their families and communities. It's happening in the criminal system. It's then doubling up and importing that same piece into the immigration system.
Wow. Yeah, since we've started talking about policing and the school to prison to deportation pipeline, I wanted to bring in, I know that IDP has done some work around the New Way Forward campaign / resolution. Can you just explain what it is briefly for our listeners and where it's at right now?
Yes, and thanks for asking about this, especially after what we just talked about. I'm so excited to talk about the New Way Forward Act. It was introduced in the last Congress, the 116th Congress, and again has been introduced in the House this past January with 39 original co-sponsors. A couple more have thrown their support behind it since. And, what's so exciting is this is the first bill that's been introduced that I can think of that is wholly focused on dismantling the jail to deportation pipeline. Because remember, all of the executive orders and ICE policy directives in the world won't change the unjust immigration laws that are already on the books, right? They can bite at the margins, they can, quote unquote, prioritize enforcement. But in the end, we will need to change the law and move completely away from this codifying in the immigration system, reliance on the criminal system and policing of Black and brown communities. And that's what New Way Forward tries to do. And when I say change the laws, I'm talking largely about two sets of laws that were passed in 1996, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, ETPA, and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. Together, these laws largely created the deportation and detention machinery that we've been seeing used, not just over the last 4 years, but as you mentioned earlier on this podcast, for many years, for the last 25 years, has been used to deport millions of people. And then so these laws significantly expanded the criminal system context that would trigger deportation. They made deportation and detention, essentially mandatory minimums in many cases, stripped judicial review, enabled the federal government to corral local law enforcement resources in service of deportation. And, New Way Forward doesn't do everything, but it is a blueprint for where we need to go to start to dismantle that. I can highlight a few key parts of New Way Forward. Do you think that would be helpful?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, actually.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. So, because I like talking about New Way Forward. So the core piece of New Way Forward is to begin to restrict the pipeline that funnels people from the criminal system to the deportation system. So, we're talking about eliminating the controlled substance and moral turpitude grounds of removability that we talked about. So, eliminating a couple of things that both will prevent someone who's otherwise eligible for status from getting status and eliminate these triggers that will make someone who already has a green card subject to deportation. It institutes a 5-year statute of limitations by which if DHS is going to use an old conviction to trigger deportation, it can't be many years later. Something we've often seen, and something you've probably seen as well, is someone may have a conviction, often when they're 18, 19, 20 years old. They rebuild their life, just many, many years later, 5 a.m. in the morning, ICE is breaking down their doors, right, and arresting them in front of their kids, guns drawn, because of this old conviction. Or perhaps someone applies for citizenship, right, and instead of getting citizenship because of an old conviction, that leads to detention and immigration deportation. So there's a 5-year statute of limitations. It also decriminalizes migration. So right now, immigration-related crimes are some of the most, are the fastest growing prosecutions in federal court by the federal government. And then so this repeals a set of laws that were actually written by white supremacists 100 years ago that criminalizes illegal entry and reentry. The New Way Forward gets rid of that. It also changes, it eliminates mandatory detention and ensures that the federal government doesn't contract with for-profit prison companies or contract with local governments to cage people. It prevents the federal government from corralling local law enforcement into helping to identify and deport people. So sort of being complicit in that. So those are a few things. It also allows for an opportunity, a process for certain people to come home after an unfair deportation. So those aren't the only things, but these are a few of the ways in which it's starting to dismantle that, criminal system to deportation pipeline.
That's fantastic. And A New Way Forward is an apt name for the campaign. I'm often very, skeptical of campaign names, but this really would change immigration policy for the first time since '96, really. So yeah, it's just fantastic. We're running a little short on time, but I just have one more question for you, Benita. IDP and IDP's partner, what are you all doing to push back against not only the harmful aspects of Biden's immigration plan, but also the ways that immigrants are still being criminalized while all of these bills are moving?
Sure. So, it's a few different things. One is on the federal level, we are trying to push back against exclusions in the citizenship bill so they can be more inclusive, building support for new ways forward, supporting dismantling the federal government's deportation and detention apparatus, detainers, detention spaces. But I think one thing that's important here is a reminder that there's also work that we can do at the state level to blunt the impact of these federal policies. So IDP and a number of others have are part of the New York Justice Roadmap, and I think we can look to that to see what may be needed. I know you all are part of this effort as well, and this platform is important because it recognizes that the immigration and criminal systems are entangled, gives us a vehicle to address the problems by bringing CRIM and IM advocates and community members together. And it calls for a number of things like marijuana legalization, decriminalizing syringes, decriminalizing certain sex offenses. The one thing I want to highlight today, though, is the New York for All campaign. And that's about building a more inclusive New York by disrupting the local jail to deportation pipeline that, we keep talking about. We know that one way that ICE carries out its deportation agenda is by corralling local governments to be partners in identifying and arresting people. So New York for All interrupts this cycle by prohibiting local law enforcement and state agencies from conspiring with ICE in this way. So, I think we can think about state level advocacy that can be done. And then in terms of detention, there's a number of things. We're part of a lawsuit in New Jersey to get people released from the Elizabeth Detention Center. And, one just really important piece, I think, is that we at IDP are trying to think deeply about what it means to belong in the U.S. What do the racial justice uprisings this summer and the impact of COVID on people who are incarcerated, what does that mean for what's fair and right in this country? Why are we using the term aggravated felony as this shortcut to import all of the racist policing into the immigration system? And, just starting to think broader about how can we envision a different country, where everyone is treated fairly.
Well, thank you so much, Benita. This, of course, you are always a wealth of knowledge for BCBF and all of our partners. And yeah, thanks so much for joining our, our little podcast that could. You can learn more about IDP by visiting immigrantdefenseproject.org. And thanks so much for listening to us. If you haven't already, please subscribe. You can also visit our website, brooklynbailfund.org. And you can follow us on all of the socials, BK Bail Fund Twitter, Brooklyn Bail Fund on Instagram. And as always, until we are all free, talk to you next week.